We don't play all music, only good music. We're Damn Radio.
Damn straight. We are indeed Damn Radio, and this is International Flavor. My name is Samuel Trapp. I'm very glad to have you tonight on the program, and I wish to do a little bit of continuing with what we were discussing last night. But before we get to that, I've been playing around with something all day just because I find it amusing. I don't know how many of you know this about me, but in a former life, way back in high school, I was a very serious, excuse me, math geek, for lack of a better word. You know, I very much enjoyed math. I took, I remember a course, one of my favorite courses toward the end was something, and as a senior in high school, was something called analytic geometry. And I particularly enjoyed proofs, theorems, and things like that. And I was always a smart aleck. I've been a smart aleck my entire life. And poor Mr. Frederick, way back then, he'd been my math teacher, since 7th, 8th grade, you know, every year, a small community. He taught any of the higher level math for every grade he taught, you know. And so I had progressed through his courses for years, and he knew my smart ass tendencies, but he also knew that I would complete the work. And this story really is going somewhere, but I got to tell you something about poor Mr. Frederick and what I did to him. Like I said, I've always been kind of a smart aleck. Well, gee, surprise, surprise. Who would have ever guessed that? Anyway, you know what I forgot? I forgot to say I'm very glad to have you all listening this evening, and that you can listen to all my past shows at damnradio.com/podcasts, or you can go out just to internationalflavor.com, and they are all just laying out there waiting for you to listen to. So you can go back and listen to have all of these hilarious moments in the privacy of your own sitting room. It's fun and only slightly illegal. So there you have it. Anyway, poor Mr. Frederick, we tormented him forever because he was a really good guy and he was a great teacher and he really knew his stuff. And he put up with us, you know, being smart Alex. He had all the traps, and there was a good pile of us. And he noted that the girls, none of whom were very good at math or cared to be, but all of the young men in the family had gone through those classes, and he enjoyed having us because we understood it and could go through it. Anyway, here, fast forward, first day of class, senior year, there we sit, you know, waiting for Mr. Frederick, and there's a word on the board, and that word is City Lana. That's actually two words, I'm sorry. City Lana, all capital, two words, City Lana. And, okay, Cityllana. We're like, okay, that makes sense. Not. And and underneath it was this, it's called a theorem, a proof, whatever you want to do it. And so basically you put two lines up and you are proving a concept. And so this theorem or proof was called the derivation for the formula of an ellipse. And you had to prove why an ellipse had, you know, the characteristics that it did. So you would go through and postulate something on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you would prove whatever concept that was. Like, for example, the first step was divide the ellipse in half, and you're trying to figure out the area of an ellipse or whatever you want to figure out about the ellipse, right? And so you divide it in half, and so the line is going through the middle. And what characteristics do we know about the line? We know the line has a principle of blah. And so on the right-hand side, you'd say the principle of line, right? And you'd put that out there, or that a line can cut this thing in half. And so, we might need to come back later and double it, but that's the same principle. So dividing in half, something like that. And then you would take another line and take it from the center of the first line and run it over to the edge of the ellipse on the other point. And you'd say, well, it's the same principle because we're dividing that half in half. And it's the same thing. And then you would take a line that doesn't touch the ellipse, but it touches the corners of the two lines and creates basically a right triangle in the upper portion, right? And you'd say, well, here's a principle that if we take this, we can create the line, and we can create this line. And then when we know the length of that line, we can determine the area inside that triangle, because A squared times B squared equals C squared, and that's the rule of a right triangle. And if you had fun doing this in high school, you probably know what I'm talking about. So you start with, but the point is, and I'm not going to go through the whole theorem because frankly, I don't remember it anymore, but he had this thing written on the board, and this theorem was extremely long. And then this city lana's up on top. There's this big elliptical shape drawn up on top with all of these rules that are put in it. And then down below is when you create a theorem, it's basically a T. So on the left, you say, theorem divided in two, theorem, you've assigned the theorem an area of X, and you say X equals unknown. And so we have the unknown, and that's the proposition that you have. And then you've created this half principle. You have to put that on the right hand side and say why you're doing it, and then what the principle is on the right that you're following. Okay. And each step has a mathematical equation tied to it, as well as a proving a proving step. So that's why they call it a proof. You're proving that you can determine how much area is in this elliptical shape if you can know the length of, one of the right triangle, and a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into it. But anyway, this derivation for the formula of ellipse was on the circle, the elliptical shape was on the top, and below it was this T that is down below. And then you had however many steps, like 18 steps, 20 steps, 20 steps, all listed below it. And then A, B, C were the points on the triangle. X, Y, Z were points on another triangle on the other side going a different way. And then you had all of these points on the outer side of the ellipse. You had all kinds of stuff. So there were all kinds of variables in there. But if you're a decent mathematician, if you have the variable, you can determine all the rest. That was the nature of math, right? And so there are geniuses that still know how to do this by hand. And not me, definitely not me. Maybe back then because I really enjoyed it, but I cheated. And here's how here's how it went. That was written on the board. This huge thing, City Lana, circle, T on the bottom, and the T on the left-hand side were your propositions. On the right-hand side were your proving concepts, right? And so anyway, this was on there. Mr. Frederick comes walking in a couple minutes late. We're all sitting there, dinking around, and he comes walking in. And old Mr. Frederick was very short. In fact, I was the only person in the class shorter than Mr. Frederick, having, actually, I think I might have passed him up when I was a senior in high school. But in 11th grade, I was still definitely shorter than him because I was only 4'10" in 11th grade, very short. And then in between the summer of 11th and 12th grade, I grew I went from 4'10" to 5'9", which is my current height. Well, maybe I'm shrinking these days. I'm down like 5'8.5", they say. But at any rate, that's the scenario. There we sit in a school in Minnesota, maybe 23 kids. It was 23 kids in the class, and there we sit. And Mr. Frederick is trying to explain this, and he comes in. He goes, "City Lana." And we all look at him. He knows us because we've all been in his class for years, and we don't know where in the hell he's going. But obviously, there's going to be some point at some period in history we'll figure this out. And he goes, "Can anybody tell me what this means?" He's like, "No, none of us knew. None of us cared to know." He said, "Well, we'll get to that. We'll get back to that. And what I want you to do," he says, "is get out, a notebook, get out some paper, and I want you to put this to memory because here I'm here to tell you, I'm a pretty straight up person, and your final exam." This is going to be a significant part of your exam. I don't remember. He said what significant part, but I don't remember if it was going to be 1/3 or 1/2. I really don't remember. He said, "You will have to prove this theorem on the final exam, and you have to be able to quote it from memory and put this down and get it committed to memory because this will be on the exam." I believe this is the only time I ever made a teacher cry was poor Mr. Frederick, and when I was a senior in high school. And I did some pretty clever things, let's say, or evil things, depending on how you look at it. At any rate, but I loved Mr. Frederick. I thought he was a fantastic teacher, and he, hell, I still remember him to this day. Good guy. And I can't imagine he isn't passed away by now. I hate to say that, but you know how when you're young, who knows how old these teachers are? But he seemed rather old. Who knows? Maybe he wasn't, and I was completely mistaken. Anyway, I don't know why I'm telling you this ridiculous. Actually, I do know why I'm telling you this ridiculous story, but it will prove a point here in just a second, because we want to get to last night's topic as well. But first, I want to tell you about this theorem because I had this cool idea today, and I think I'm going to use it as the logo for the show out on International Flavor. So when you click on the show, you can actually see this theorem that I've created. Okay, and it's a proof that I've created, and it's not the derivation for the formula of an ellipse, but it's something equally as important as that derivation. Okay. So anyway, he says, so commit this to memory, and we'll see you in December when the final exam comes. We'll see you then. So in the middle of my senior year, my father got relocated with his job, and we ended up moving from a little town in Minnesota called Foley, Minnesota, to a place just outside of Quincy, Illinois. My father took a job in Quincy, and we bought a house just on the outskirts outside. And so we ended up not going to school in the reasonably decent sized school of Quincy, but we went to this little school called Liberty High School. And when I went there were like 52 kids in my graduating class. They had a class called Senior Math. So I quit school right there in my senior year, but and went to college. I went to college early, 6 months, because they were so far behind. It was nonsense. And I had more than enough credits to graduate because our schools in Minnesota were way ahead of the schools in Illinois, right? But at any rate, that's not the story. Mr. Frederick, we had the final exam before we left for Christmas break. Was the final exam. And I had a plan. Okay, I created a plan. I had some cohorts in school, had some partners in crime in school, and there were 23 of us. And what I did was I collected, I don't remember how much, $7 from every kid. in the class. And they all loved this idea. And I was like, you have to keep this super duper quiet. This is a surprise. And we need $7 a piece. And we're going to say farewell. Most of us, this was going to be our last math class, although there was like statistics or something for the next semester, right? So on the day of the final exam, come like right before Christmas, whatever the last days of Christmas are, we all come wandering into class, and I have a package in my hand as a kind of a wrapped Christmas gift for Mr. Frederick. And he had a habit of whatever period in class, and he didn't do this in every math class that we had with him, but in that year, he was always late. And like he had been in the lounge before and he had to come wandering down to get to us. So he was always a couple minutes late, getting to class, which was perfect for our purposes. So when he walked into class, we all stood up and I handed him the package and said, well, Mr. Frederick, we've all enjoyed having you. For me personally, I am going to miss your classes and being in them. And here, Merry Christmas, gave him a gift. And all of us, when he opened the gift, we already, of course, knew what it was. And I think he did too, because each of us were dressed in a black T-shirt. And on the front of the T-shirt was this theorem. The T on the front of the T-shirt, so you could look down at your T-shirt. So the black T-shirt was supposed to be like a blackboard, and on the front you could look down at your T-shirt and see the T that the theorem is produced, and on the right side you could see the proofs, and on the left side you could see your propositions. And so you could just look down at your shirt and copy this all into your exam. And on the back of your shirt was a huge ellipse, an elliptical shape with all the X's, all the ABCs, all the lines, everything done. And across the top of the front and the back, the T-shirt read City Lana, just like he had put on the board. And we had come to find out over the class that City Lana is actually analytic spelled backward, and he was just being clever, but that was his little cleverness to say City Lana. And so he told us that like day one or whatever. I don't remember if any of us ever figured it out. I don't think so. I think he ended up telling us. But we had that, and when we handed him his, we had ordered 24 of these shirts, and there was one left, and Mr. Frederick was a very small guy, and he got the very small T-shirt, just like me, by the way, because I was small also, and he actually cried about that. He thought we were nuts. In fact, he was so pleased that he let us all continue to wear the T-shirts and not take them off. And so he thought that was extremely clever to do that and to tell that story. And that is what we did to poor Mr. Frederick. Well, what does that have to do with my program tonight, with anything that I'm here to tell you about this evening? Why is it important herein? It is important because I have come up with my own theorem, and my theorem, which doesn't require any real any enormous proofs, but my theory is this. And some people may not like what I'm about to say, but I'm here to tell you I believe it to be true, and I think that many of you will as well, depending on your bent in life and whether you are are a believer in some of the things I talk about or not, and you're not required to be at all. So I want to give you, let's see, I gotta pull it up. I had several versions of it that I had to create of my own theorems, and I want to bring it up. This one is the theorem for why I believe that Trump 2.0 is identical to Biden 1.0. So the analytical proof starts out with saying that despite the appearance of contrast, Trump 2.0 equals Biden 1.0 in practical international policy. Okay, and here's why. So at the top of your theorem, you have Trump is not equal to Biden, but on the right half, you go Trump 2.0 does equal Biden 1.0. And then you have your statement and proposition on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you have a justification and the rule applied. And I found this rather entertaining when I was putting it together. So Trump takes office in 2017. This is step one, and it's 10 steps. Trump takes office in 2017. That is a given. So the rule is that's a given. That's our, what we're saying. Number two, Trump imposes 25% tariffs on China. That is a starting assumption. Okay. Number three, Biden criticizes Trump's tariffs in 2020. This is called the trade war principle. This is the rule that comes out, right? Number four, Biden leaves Trump's tariffs in place. So first he criticized him, but then he left him in place. This is called the rule is the rhetorical opposition rule, meaning we don't really object to anything the other side does. We just say we do. Okay, so that's the rhetorical opposition rule. Okay. Number five, Biden expands export controls on chips to China. This is called the hypocrisy preservation corollary or the global tech dominance axiom. So these are, universal rules that do apply. Okay. Now, here we go back to Trump. Trump 2.0 reinstates tariffs under Liberation Day in 2025. This is called the policy echo theorem or the establishment doctrine. Yes. Number 8, Biden funds Ukraine defense and supports NATO expansion. This is called the minimal divergence rule or the surveillance state principle. Trump, this is number 9, Trump 2.0 continues Ukraine NATO position with minor rhetoric. This is called the authoritarian continuity dilemma. Okay, so that's added on. And finally, number 10, Biden supports TikTok ban and surveillance powers, which means that in the proven policy convergence theorem, between the two, Trump 2.0 equals Biden 1.0. They both have the same practical international policies of what they were doing. And I thought we should all embrace that fact, the fact that they are identical from an international perspective. We thought the old Trumpster was going to be different, but he's not. There's nothing different. It's all, unfortunately, exactly the same. And these principles, the analytical proof, I have it. I can share it with you. And now I'm sure it's going to become very globally relevant. I may win some sort of economic award for this. Truthfully, if I put it out there in the general atmosphere, tell you what, there are going to be people who go, oh my God, that guy is a mathematical and economic genius. Just look at him. And that would be me, by the way. I am so far ahead of the elliptical curve these days that, perhaps I should be an analytic geometry teacher. Or perhaps not, because I don't remember how any of that goes. All righty. I wanted to offer for you, if you wished to phone in tonight, you may do so, 573-746-8020. If you wanted to go out to my International Flavor Facebook page and contribute out there. Facebook, International Flavor. Very good stuff, Maynard. But tonight, I wanted to proceed with where we were last night. Okay? Because we were talking last night about the fact that people are treated differently who are going to Ukraine to fight on the side of Ukraine from the American side, or going to fight in Russia. There are some. There aren't anywhere near as many, but there are some that people that went out there to fight. Plenty have died. I think that there's some kind of a I don't know. I think there's plenty of lying about it. That's what I think. I think there's plenty of cover up. But even when you go out and try to find the evidence of combat deaths, you'll never find them in the United States Pentagon parts. Because if you remember, we were talking last night that U.S. officials always maintain that American military on Ukrainian soil are limited to, non-combat, non-front line sorts of roles. Okay, and that was not necessarily true between 2014 to 2021, but allegedly nobody died in any of that when they were training or teaching any of these Ukrainian teams to fight. Okay, I wanted to put out some of the sources for this. There was a March 2024 analysis of foreign fighters in Ukraine, which included Canadian and American volunteers, and Russia's claims of mercenary casualties. So Reuters in 2022 put out reports on British volunteer casualties. Remember, we talked about Jordan Gatley and captured foreign fighters, Aslan Pinner, Sadoun, being sentenced by DPR, Donetsk People's Republic. CBS News in 2021 said the release of American POW stories. The Guardian had an investigation into Michael Gloss and his disappearance. I have a huge list of sources that I went and listed. There was Investigatable, Newsweek, Yahoo, Newsweek again, Mercenaries in Ukraine, Fact Checkers on the U.S., NATO chief Cloutier not captured in Ukraine. So plenty of discussion on that topic. And I wanted to continue on some of this because we had just gotten into part 2. And I'm going to cover a little bit about that again, repeating to what I talked about yesterday. And basically, I wanted to get into the legal overview of what could or should happen to these people. I don't say should because I don't really give a rip, but if it happens, I want it to be done fairly, meaning both sides. If you're going out on your country and you're thinking of going to war against another sovereign nation for a third sovereign nation, you better think long and hard about that, because you find the right prosecutor, a prosecutor who wants to go after you. But prosecutors, they have that prosecutorial discretion. And so some can, some will, and some won't, but they can or cannot. And you can't say a damn thing about it, even if it's not fair, even if, they just pick and choose. And one of them says, well, wait a minute, I only prosecute black guys. Arguably, you can't do crap about that, because a prosecutor has absolute prosecutorial discretion. He can charge or he cannot charge. One of the lessons we learned from grand juries is that grand juries are just BS. I won't say it. We'll call it horse pucky. It is whatever you want to call it, but a grand jury is crap. It means absolutely nothing for somebody to be indicted by a grand jury. That is a zero principle. Maybe I should do a theorem on that, but the theorem would contain something like. But the only point of this is that prosecutors can decide to prosecute you, or not prosecute you, and there ain't a damn thing you can do about it. Okay. And a lot of prosecutors will use the concept of the grand jury to get out of filing charges against somebody, because, well, I presented the evidence and that grand jury didn't indict. Or if they do want to indict somebody, but they don't want to take responsibility for it. Oh, I presented the evidence and the grand jury said, you can't blame me. The grand jury indicted him, not me. So a grand jury is basically a prosecutorial cop-out. That's what that is. And at any level, by the way, it doesn't matter. It's a cop-out. So at any, and I should tell you why, I suppose, because it's only one side of the alleged evidence being presented. So it's a pretty crappy prosecutor who can't put enough evidence in front of a grand jury for the grand jury to not say something back to him. It's the same concept I tell you about what the Missouri bar BS did to me. They sent letters to former clients, asked them to come in and collect money by blaming me for being, I don't know what, for stealing their money. And if they would claim that, then the Missouri bar will give them money, but it's only one party sitting there. Wouldn't happen in any other profession. That is the same thing as a grand jury. The grand jury, you only get one side of the story. The defendant's not allowed to be there. No lawyer for the defendant is allowed to cross-examine any portion of any evidence that is put in. It's only one side presented. How in the world can a prosecutor be that horrible of a prosecutor to not get a grand jury to indict? There's a saying that, a good grand jury could prosecute a ham sandwich. Well, they could. You'd need a pretty gifted, if you want to call it that, prosecutor to say it. But a grand jury's BS. Okay. And at any rate, the only reason I tell you that whole story is because, truthfully, a prosecutor has the discretion to either charge any American volunteer who fought on the sides of either Ukraine or Russia against the other, because there's a law, 18 U.S.C. 960, called the Neutrality Act, and it prohibits organizing a military expedition against a nation at peace with the United States. This is potentially applicable to Americans fighting on either side, Russia or Ukraine, since the U.S. is not formally at war with Russia or Ukraine. But this law has been rarely enforced in modern times anyway, and no American volunteers in Ukraine's forces have been prosecuted under it to date. Okay? American law provides that joining a foreign nation's military could jeopardize a U.S. citizen's citizenship if it's done with the intent to renounce allegiance, especially if that foreign military is fighting the United States. So, if if you were in war in Vietnam and you decided to go over to Vietnam and fight on the other side with the Vietnamese against the United States people, well, you're going to get charged most likely. Okay. In practice, because the U.S. has not declared war on Russia, this provision hasn't been tested in court for any volunteers to this conflict. U.S. officials have nevertheless, only for the Russian side, okay, floated the possibility that, under some circumstances, Americans could face criminal penalties or even risk losing their citizenship by taking part in this overseas conflict. Let's see. I want to open that up for you. And if it'll let me. Well, this overreaching rationale has both national security and foreign policy elements. Washington fears that Americans fighting abroad might be exploited by foreign intelligence agents involved in atrocities or spark diplomatic incidents if captured. State Department made it clear it would not be able to protect U.S. citizens in Ukraine or Russia, and that Americans caught in the war, especially by Russia, could be singled out for harsh treatment. So, if you're here to believe what they're saying, if you're fighting in a war, the harsh treatment, you're going to be killed anyway. If you're fighting, on either side, you have the possibility of dying. Okay. Against this backdrop, the U.S. response to Americans who defied the warnings has been more of an administrative caution rather than criminal prosecution. We're going to examine several cases of American-born individuals who joined in Ukraine or Russia after 2022. The focus of any U.S. government actions like passport revocations or travel restrictions issued in either case. We will also describe what became of these volunteers, whether they have returned home, remained abroad by choice or compulsion, or faced other sorts of fallout. Okay? First, we're going to talk about some for Ukraine. Dozens of American citizens, I'd say closer to hundreds of American citizens, have elected to fight on behalf of Ukraine. Many of them were U.S. military veterans. Ukraine's International Legion reported thousands of American applicants, although only a few hundred were accepted due to strict vetting procedures. They're not being so strict with their own people. They wanted military experience to be part of the deal and a couple other things. These Americans signed contracts to follow, let's see if I can get to that article. Wouldn't that be entertaining? Here it comes. This came from something called the Ukrainian Embassy in the United States. This article came out, doesn't have the exact date here. Ukrainian Embassy in the United States. Americans want to join us fighting Russia. It's according to the article, diplomats received inquiries from 6,000 United States citizens seeking to fight against Russia. Okay. And that came from Major General Boris Kremensky, a defense attaché with the Embassy of Ukraine, who said that volunteers are asked to bring their own gear and travel to Poland for entry to Ukraine. Okay. And this came out in March of 2022. Okay. And Ukraine's embassy is taking on an unexpected role in recruitment Isn't that loony? Anyway, that article was put out by Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera is usually a pretty good source for news. They're not horribly twisted. Okay. So these Americans signed contracts with Ukrainian armed forces. U.S. response: the U.S. did not criminalize or punish these pro-Ukrainian volunteers. They repeatedly formally advised all Americans not to travel to Ukraine and emphasized that anyone who did so at their own risk. But after the war began, John Kirby publicly urged American veterans not to join the fight, but to support Ukraine in other ways. Despite these warnings, no charges were filed against Americans who served in Ukraine's Legion. Several U.S. citizens even spoke openly about their service upon returning without legal repercussion. This de facto tolerance reflects foreign policy context. The U.S. government is sympathetic to Ukraine's defense as well as to the Neutrality Act's ambiguity. The State Department said that merely going abroad to enlist in a foreign army is not a crime under U.S. law unless there was recruitment or a military organization or expedition formed on U.S. soil, right? There have been no documented cases of the U.S. revoking anyone's passport, any volunteer, because they fought in Ukraine. Volunteers traveled on their own U.S. passports, usually through Poland. One American ex-soldier eager to join the fight even worked with his congressman to get an emergency passport so he could deploy to Ukraine in March of 2022. U.S. consular services in Kiev were suspended during the beginning of this campaign, so some Americans had logistical hurdles, like replacing a lost passport would require going to a U.S. embassy in a neighboring country. But there's no indication the State Department arbitrarily canceled any volunteer's passport as a punitive manner. On the contrary, when American fighters were in danger or needed extraction, U.S. officials provided typical consular assistance. For example, two Alabama veterans, the ones I told you about yesterday, Alex Drueke, who was 39, and Andy Huyn, who was 27, a former Marine, volunteered in Ukraine and were captured by Russia in June of 2022. They were held for 3 months. With threatened execution. Remember, they were found guilty of a crime because they didn't hold Ukrainian passports. And so Russia charged them. The U.S. government, while stressing that these men were private citizens, worked through intermediaries in Saudi Arabia to secure the release in a prisoner swap. And upon release, they were checked by U.S. Embassy and flown back to the United States. They arrived home to a hero's welcome and faced no U.S. legal action for having fought in a foreign army. In fact, the State Department thanked Ukraine for including former volunteers in the exchange and reiterated its standing travel warning to other Americans. Both men have resumed life in the U.S. One report even noted that after returning home, Drueke served as the best man in Huyn's wedding. Other Americans who fought in Ukraine have had similar outcomes. Malcolm Nance was a U.S. Navy veteran and an author. He joined the Ukraine International Legion in 2022 and fought in active combat. He was quite public about his service. He gave interviews from the front, wrote a book about the war, suffered no apparent penalty upon return to the U.S. Many volunteer fighters cycle back to the U.S. after their tour of duty, often for personal or medical reason, again without incident at U.S. ports of entry. U.S. has not attempted to strip citizenship or restrict travel. However, volunteers do lose protections of some sort. If they were to be injured or killed, they and their families do not receive military benefits, and if they are captured by Russia, they are not considered U.S. servicemen, which complicates some rescue efforts. American volunteers also reported upon return that they had debriefings by U.S. officials. Curious. Wonder why. Wonder why. Not as interrogations, but to glean intelligence on Russian tactics for the Ukrainians. Or to ensure the returning fighters don't pose any security risk, like checking that they were not recruited by hostile intelligence while abroad. What is hostile intelligence is very interesting. In summary, American fighters for Ukraine have been treated as private citizens exercising personal agency, which is against U.S. advice, but it's okay. The U.S. response was to warn and discourage, perform consular duties and debriefings, not to revoke passports or to prosecute. This approach, hands off, aligns with historical precedent. Americans who joined allied foreign armies, like the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I, or Kurdish forces against ISIS, when that occurred, were rarely prosecuted as long as their actions didn't violate U.S. law. It appears U.S. government's priority is to avoid entanglement or escalation by making it clear that these volunteers do not represent the U.S. government rather than punish the individual. Okay. I am not against any of that. Okay. I want equal treatment for all. This is what I say. If you're going to allow people to go and join up with the Kurds to fight somebody else, if you're going to allow them to go to China and fight against the Pakistan or Indians in that little sliver of land that has been disputed for 20 years, so be it. If you're going to let Pakistan and India duke it out and one American goes and picks one side or the other to fight on, fine. Okay. None of those people are we at war with. So they should all be treated just the same. Okay. But let's talk about Americans who volunteer for Russia's military. Okay. Far fewer Americans chose to fight for Russia, but a handful of cases have been documented. These individuals effectively took arms up against Ukraine, and get this, and by extension, against U.S. policy, since the U.S. supports Ukraine. Do we? The statute didn't say that. The statute says that they have to be, they have to be a U.S. enemy, somebody that they've declared war against. Okay, and that is not Russia. In several instances, they became propaganda tools, according to State Department, for Moscow. They're showcased as proof that some Americans side with Russia. There are a buttload of Americans who side with Russia, including me. Am I guilty of propaganda over here? Am I? And I don't, how do I want to say this? I don't not support Ukraine. I say hands off. None of our business. Who are we to judge? We are morons and have been for some time on the international policy level. And if you remember my theorem from the first part of this, now Trump is all in. This is his war, and Trump 2.0 equals Biden 1.0 in foreign policy matters. And my theorem has proved it. So, perhaps you should order that T-shirt from me. I'm making T-shirts even now with this theorem put on it. And I think it's going to be a very effective theorem, and it will soon be in the history books. Okay. In several instances, blah, 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 I already said that. The U.S. government's approach to these cases has been cautious. No American is known to have been criminally charged with treason or aiding the enemy for joining Russian forces as of 2023 and 24, likely because the U.S. is not formally at war with Russia. and such prosecutions would be extremely rare. Instead, U.S. authorities appear to have relied on administrative and indirect measures to punish these people. Okay, we treat them differently. Revoking passports when other legal grounds exist, leveraging existing warrants, or ensuring that these Americans remain outside of U.S. jurisdiction. So, in effect, an American citizen who cast their lot with Moscow find themselves stranded abroad or chose to stay abroad, sometimes taking on Russian citizenship, and they would presumably face serious hurdles if they attempted to come back. Here are some examples. John McIntyre Bama, defector from Ukraine Legion to the Russian side. McIntyre, 25-year-old former Army private, went to Ukraine in 2022 and enlisted in the International Legion, only to defect to the Russian side in February 2023. He became the first known American, and indeed the first foreign legionary of any kind, to cross over to Russian forces. In Russia's media interviews, he claimed that he infiltrated the Ukrainian ranks intentionally to gather intelligence for Russia. Fellow Legion fighters described him as unstable and said he was expelled from the unit for misconduct before he fled, suggesting the defection may have been opportunistic. Once he was in Moscow, McIntyre was paraded on the RT network, and he echoed Russian propaganda. He said he'd seen Nazi elements in Ukraine. Well, who hasn't, by the way? They exist. So maybe he did. And he's aligned with Putin's false, they claim, okay, the State Department, his false denazification justification, right? That Russia has talked about. They want to get rid of the Nazi issues. Those things have been proved many times, that it does exist. The ultra-nationalist extreme Nazism does exist. Germany was booting people out that came to be trained, that were wearing swastikas and the SS symbols and carrying these Banderov type of elements. That stuff has been over and over proven. Okay. The U.S. response. Let's talk about this. McIntyre has not been indicted for his actions. No false grand jury for him. That he hasn't been indicted. It's possible that U.S. intelligence opened an inquiry about him behind closed doors. I'm sure they did. After all, he handed over details about Ukraine's foreign fighters and positions to Russia, an adversary. Now, but I thought Russia wasn't an adversary. We're not at war with Russia. NATO is not at war with Russia. Ukraine is not necessarily an ally in this respect anyway. They're just people that come over and beg for money and then they get it. So I don't know. I'd be interested in defending this guy, if he ever was charged with something, because it's a pretty, nonsensical step. This could be viewed as providing material support to an enemy force. But because Russia is not a designated terrorist organization, the legal pathway, such as charging him under the Neutrality Act or for unlawful intelligence gathering, are quite murky and difficult to prove, or would be. Rather than pursue a risky treason charge, I don't know how you could say treason. You disagree with one side and want to take the other. Don't you have that right? The U.S. appears content to let McIntyre stay in Russia. I wonder what would happen to him if he wanted to come home. He remains there as of last report, presumably unable or unwilling to return to the U.S. Any attempt to travel on his U.S. passport would probably trigger scrutiny or cancellation of the document on national security grounds. Remember, the State Department has the authority to revoke a passport of an individual if an individual's return would be a security threat, or if a valid felony arrest warrant exists. In McIntyre's case, there's no public warrant. The main barrier to his return is a political return. He has allied himself with a hostile power, is what they claim, in an ongoing conflict. U.S. officials have not commented on him by name, but their general policy is that Americans fighting for Russia are on their own. McIntyre has effectively stranded himself, a self-imposed exile with an uncertain future in Russia. Well, he was 25 freaking years old. What do you know about any of that? I'd be very interested in finding out the final story. This is all fairly current, right? Another guy named Seth Will Baker, who's a former Marine wearing a Russian uniform. Another defector is a guy named Seth Baker. And they use the word defector here. He identified himself as a Marine veteran in a Russian military video in 2024. He served in the Marine Corps in the United States from 2019 till 2022 and left at the rank of Lance Corporal after refusing COVID-19 vaccine mandates. In mid-2024, Russian Telegram channels featured Baker, dressed in Russian combat gear and occupied in eastern Ukraine. They proclaimed that he had joined the Russian armed forces. Russian media reported that Baker traveled to Donbass to sign up, but independent outlets could not verify all the details of that. In the clip, Baker cited grievances with the U.S., such as the military's vaccine requirement, as part of his rationale for, they call it switching sides, but he didn't. U.S. response: Baker does not appear to face any U.S. criminal actions at this time. He was discharged from the Marines, so he's civilian. His actions, while alarming to many, don't clearly violate U.S. law, absent proof that he was recruited or paid while on U.S. soil. Thus, like McIntyre, he has not been charged with treason or any other crime. But by openly fighting for Russia, he is probably on a U.S. security watch list. His U.S. passport could be canceled if authorities determine his activities fall under supporting an adversary in conflict with a U.S. interest. That'd be a pretty iffy case, but that doesn't mean a prosecutor wouldn't file it, especially given that Russia's military and some like Wagner mercenary groups are under heavy U.S. sanctions, right? So if you provide material support to a sanctioned entity or a designated transnational criminal organization, which I think they said that Wagner Group was, then you could be subject to grounds for U.S. Criminal action. In his last appearance, Baker remains inside Russian-held territory. This means he's unable to travel back to the U.S. without passing through countries likely to detain and extradite him. Yeah, but why would they extradite him if he hasn't been charged with anything? Or he might be without a valid U.S. travel document. There's no indication that he has acquired Russian citizenship, so he may be just stuck in limbo under Russian protection. The Kremlin has said that his service is aimed to embarrass Washington. U.S. officials have not publicly addressed his case beyond their standard warning that Americans should not be in Ukraine or Russian combat zones. The implied U.S. policy is to treat him as a defector who willingly removed himself from U.S. consular protection. Why? Ukrainians have army people have defected. Why? I don't understand the difference. And I'm trying, to get there, but so far I don't see it. Except unless you want to call Russia our enemy for some reason. Okay, here's another one. Wilmer Puelio Mota, who's an airman turned propagandist. This one did have his passport revoked, though indirectly. Wilmer, a former U.S. Air Force tech sergeant from Massachusetts, his case is unusual because he was allegedly in legal trouble at home before he went to Russia. In 2019 and 20, while serving in the Air National Guard and holding a local city council seat, he was charged in Rhode Island with child pornography and related offenses. He was due in court in January 2022, but he scabbered off. He was scarfing. Instead, he absconded. By May of 2022, he had secretly fled to the U.S. and later resurfaced in Russia. In August of 2024, a Russian Defense Ministry video revealed him in uniform, calling himself Boston, working as a drone operator for Russian forces in Ukraine. In the clip, he boasts of his 10-year U.S. military service before declaring loyalty to Russia. This made him a high-profile example of an American siding with Putin's army. The U.S. response? Because Mota had outstanding U.S. felony charges, the U.S. government had clear grounds to act against him administratively. Typically, when a U.S. citizen is a fugitive from a serious criminal case, State Department will revoke their passport to prevent flight and facilitate extradition. Although not confirmed in the media, it's virtually certain, that his passport was revoked once he skipped bail. Every time his family or reporters called the State Department about his passport, they were told it was invalid. By the time he showed up in Russia, he probably had no valid U.S. travel documents. This means he's effectively marooned in Russia. If he tries to leave Russia and enters a country with a U.S. extradition, he will be arrested on the child pornography warrant. The U.S. has not charged him with any offense for fighting for Russia. The existing criminal charges are unrelated, okay? But they serve to keep him stuck abroad. In Russia, he has value as a propaganda, person. So Moscow has granted him refuge. We do this for foreigners all the time that come here under criminal charges from other countries. We grant them refuge. So we do the same thing. Whatever they're charged with, it's okay, no problem. His situation illustrates how the U.S. can use administrative processes like passport revocation to bar a volunteer from coming back to the country. So that could be an issue. Okay? Let's see. Puello Mota's own words on the Russian video make clear he has no intention of returning. He don't want to go to prison. Better to be in Russia than in prison. Should he ever attempt to return, if he somehow ended up at a U.S. embassy, he would face immediate arrest and trial on his prior charges. Okay, here's another one. Daniel Martindale. He's an American that was granted Russian citizenship for espionage. Okay? He was U.S. born and in his early 30s, and he lived covertly in Ukraine for 2 years, spying for the Russian military. He presented himself as a Christian missionary and even settled in a village in eastern Ukraine. But secretly, he was transmitting Ukrainian troop coordinates and other intelligence information, to Russia in 2022 and 23. In mid 23, a Ukrainian counterintelligence force closed in upon him, and the Russian special forces smuggled him out of Ukraine. In July of 2025, in a televised ceremony in Moscow, Martindale was personally awarded a Russian passport by Vladimir Putin's decree. Russian installed officials praised him for saving the lives of Russian soldiers and helping plan offensives. By publicly taking an oath of allegiance to Russia, he effectively became a dual citizen. Now, that's not illegal. There are buttloads of them. Lots of Russians who come here and do not give up their citizenship. And they are dual passport holders. Happens in a ton of countries. Don't know why it would be any different for this guy. Okay, so he became a dual citizen, or arguably, this is a crazy argument, which I disagree with, he arguably renounced his U.S. citizenship depending on his intent. The U.S. response is that the U.S. State Department declined to comment on his case when asked by Reuters. No charge has been announced against him through his actions aiding a foreign military targeting forces the U.S. supports could be viewed as hostile. Legally, if the U.S. determined that Martindale intended to give up his citizenship by accepting a Russian passport and swearing loyalty to Russia, they could initiate a certificate of loss of nationality procedure. But expatriation is a complex and rare and usually requires the individual to accept that loss of nationality. At the very least, one can infer that U.S. passport for Mr. Martindale is no longer valid. Wonder why. Maybe it expired, but nobody's really come up with anything on that topic. By Russian law, as a newly minted Russian citizen, he would have to surrender any other passports. Now, they do. That's right. There was a new law that passed earlier this year that Russia allegedly does not recognize dual citizenship in practice. But I think that's wrong. I'm pretty sure they do. Even if he still held a U.S. passport physically, using it would be quite perilous because U.S. authorities could revoke it on national security grounds. They could consider him an asset of a hostile power. In all likelihood, he will remain in Russia indefinitely. He has expressed that he now considers Russia his home, and Russian media celebrated that sentiment. From the U.S. perspective, Martindale is an example of an American who crossed a bright line. He allegedly enabled Russian military operations. Such conduct edges into the realm of espionage or treason. Why? I don't know. What difference does it make if you do that for the Russian side or for the Ukrainian side? If these people are in Ukraine and are sending coordinates and stuff about Russian forces, we're not at war with Russia. Why is it any different? I mean, I get that we sometimes support, what Ukraine is doing. I always thought the old Trumpster would be different, but nope, he's not. He loves the war just as much as anybody else. Let's see. By staying in Russia, he has put himself beyond the immediate reach of U.S. law enforcement. The U.S. government's silence about him suggests a decision to avoid elevating his profile. They don't want to talk about him because then the Russian information about him would become more important. Isn't that true? I don't know. Let's see. For now, the consequence he faces is exile. He's effectively banished by virtue of a passport cancellation and self-identification as Russian. Okay? We talked a little bit about this guy yesterday. His name is Russell Texas Bentley, who is a longtime militant in Donbass. Russell Bentley III was a 64-year-old Texas-born American who had a very public role on the Russian side. Former Army soldier, U.S., he moved to eastern Ukraine in 2014 and joined the pro-Russian separatists in Donbass. He became a propagandist, according to what the U.S. State Department says, known as the Donbass Cowboy or Tex, frequently appearing on Russian media. He obtained Russian citizenship years ago and settled in Donetsk. During 2022 invasion, he continued to blog and fight for Russian forces. Unconfirmed reports in 2023 said that Bentley went missing amid the fighting, and by early 2024, local authorities in Donetsk said he was presumed dead, allegedly killed under unclear circumstances. Some reports claim he may have been slain by other Russian fighters in a dispute. U.S. response. Throughout Bentley's decade-long career in the Russian forces in Ukraine, the U.S. never charged him with any crime. He was known and even interviewed by Western outlets as an American who switched sides. But he didn't switch sides. He didn't fight for Ukraine. He just decided he wanted to fight for Russia, right? But since his activities were entirely overseas, the Justice Department showed no interest in prosecuting him. It is likely that his passport expired and was not renewed once he took up arms for Russian-backed entity. By embracing Russian citizenship, he put himself outside of U.S. jurisdiction. State Department never publicly commented on his status, treated him as a private citizen who had emigrated. The implicit punishment was that he could never safely return to the U.S. without facing questions or possible legal action. For example, if the evidence emerged that he had committed a war crime, he could be prosecuted under U.S. law like the War Crimes Act. In that event, Bentley's story ended in tragedy on foreign soil, a fate not uncommon for mercenaries. His case underscores that the U.S. approach is mostly to let sleeping dogs lie. As long as he stayed abroad fighting for Russia, he was mostly ignored by the U.S. authorities. Had he tried to come home, he would have been subject to intense scrutiny and potentially had his movements restricted, because the U.S. can place returnees on a watch list or confiscate their devices at a border to probe them for illegal activity. Bentley did not test these waters. He didn't come back. So let's talk about others and general measures. In addition to the above, a few other Americans have served on Russia's war side in non-military ways. There's a guy named Patrick Lancaster, who's a Navy veteran. Now, he has a very interesting program. He's a war correspondent. I watch him all the time, and I have shown some of his paperwork. I like watching him. And he was a Navy veteran, lived in Donetsk for years as a pro-Russian independent war correspondent. He is not a uniformed soldier. He films from the Russian side and pushes Kremlin-favored narratives. So you're not allowed to tell the truth, is what they're saying. You are supposed to stick your head in the sand and believe that Ukraine is winning the war and that everything they do is golden, and what Russia is doing amounts to criminal activity, right? Makes me sick because it's a different opinion. Here's a guy publishing news. That's what he's doing. I've seen his videos. Go watch him. It's Patrick Lancaster. He's got some good videos from the front. He was chased by Ukrainian drones. I told you about that several weeks ago. Showed some. I think I even paid to his page for his Patreon account that he had. I was paying $5 a month on it for a while. Can't remember. He has not faced any U.S. charges, but working in a sanctioned region means he cannot use U.S. financial services and could be investigated if he tried to profit from propaganda. Another example is a guy named Gonzalo Lira, a California-born blogger, and he has dual Chilean nationality. He spread pro-Russian content from Ukraine. He was arrested by Ukraine for propaganda, but not pursued by the United States. The U.S. government's main tool for such individuals is sanctions or recommendation of benefits. For instance, if an American were formally found to be fighting for the Wagner Group, a Russian mercenary outfit allegedly, well, they are, designated by the U.S. as a transnational criminal organization. Only we are allowed to create such organizations. Only America can have those transnational organizations to go fight in other places. They take your 10-man team and create something and go over and fight in Iran on the side of Israel or Turkey or whoever else decides to go against them, and that's fine. But by God, don't go join another Wagner group, or don't do it for anybody but us. We create our fake little teams over here, and only ours are viable. So someone that joined a Wagner group could be subject to U.S. sanctions or charged under laws banning material support to criminal or terrorist groups. So far, we have not seen any public report of any American in Wagner's ranks. Allegedly, there were some. The FBI reportedly investigated at least one American man who attempted to join Wagner in 2023, but he was intercepted before he could depart. So they stopped it. I wonder if they charged him with anything. I haven't been able to find out. Other things they could do is passport revocations and travel bans. So Americans on the Russian side, they can face administrative actions prior to criminal prosecution. The most common is a passport revocation. A U.S. passport can be revoked for reasons including outstanding federal arrest warrants, or criminal court orders, or conviction for certain offenses, or a determination by the State Department that a passport bearer is a national security threat. In the case like Mr. Puello Mota, the passport was almost certainly canceled once he became a fugitive, the guy who was child pornography guy. Others like Martindale or Baker likely have not had their passport privileges withdrawn quietly on the national security or foreign policy ground. It's a discretionary power of the Secretary of State. The State Department typically does not announce such revocations publicly to avoid drawing attention or revealing intelligence, but the practical effect is that these individuals cannot travel to the U.S. or any country with U.S. extradition agreements without risking detention. Additionally, all Americans known to be fighting for Russia would certainly be placed on a watch list, flagged at border control systems to bar their re-entry or ensure they are interrogated if they come back to U.S. soil. But they're not interrogating Ukrainian volunteers, American volunteers who volunteered for Ukrainian side, right? In a sense, those who join the Russian military have self-selected into exile. Some obtained Russian citizenship or are seeking it. That gives Moscow leverage over them and detaches them from the U.S. As Russian citizens or residents, they can remain abroad with impunity, but that is its own punishment, as they are cut off from their homeland. We should cry for them. That is its own punishment. They went there voluntarily, friends and neighbors, so if it's probably not a punishment. It is worth noting that the rationale U.S. officials have for taking administrative action instead of or before any criminal charge is to neutralize any threat the person might pose. An American fighting for Russia could return as a provocateur or a spy. So by revoking a passport, the U.S. is preempting that scenario. Isn't that genius? It's a tool that has been used in other contexts. For example, passports were canceled for some Americans who joined ISIS or Al Qaeda to prevent them from coming back to conduct terrorism in the United States. In the Ukraine war context, Russian aligned Americans haven't tried to attack launches on the U.S., but a foreign policy concern is very clear. These individuals actively further Moscow's military objectives, so the U.S. sees little downside to stranding them abroad. Well, because we're supposed to be in love with Ukraine. We're supposed to love blue and yellow, right? That's the way it's supposed to be. Well, official U.S. explanations and policy, they still say they are acting privately. They talk about personal safety and diplomatic risk. We do not believe Ukraine is a safe place for Americans, and we urge them not to go. The Neutrality Act and legal ambiguity is also a problem. Taking up arms against a country at peace with the United States. Ukraine is at peace with the U.S., so American fighting against Ukraine could fall into that statute. Well, why wouldn't it be the same on the other side? However, using the Neutrality Act against a lone individual would be novel and politically charged. Instead of testing this, the U.S. seems to prefer administrative revocations like passport revocation, but only on the Russian side, not the Ukrainian. They also have national security concerns. They are concerned about propaganda because, you think that Ukraine isn't using Americans as propaganda over there, or everything isn't propaganda over there. They have used it and thanked all the people coming to fight on their side. It is important to mention that some Americans who fought in Ukraine have proactively engaged with Congress to seek official recognition or clarification of their status. There are reports in 2023 of American volunteer fighters who lobbied for the U.S. to create a legal framework to assist them. For example, to ensure if they are killed or injured, their families aren't left without support. However, Washington is unresponsive. This conflict remains in an area where Americans participate at their own peril. So far, they haven't got anything. In summary, the U.S. government's approach to Americans in Russia has been guided by the concern of supporting Ukraine without encouraging American freelancers and isolating those who side with Russia without turning them into martyrs. I would prefer a much more hands-off, because this is not our war, never has been. And there's zero reason for us to be involved. So what I remember when Rubio first, when he was elected and was first going over there, and what he was talking about working outside of the framework of the war to talk about trade, talking about other places to work together, global warming, greenhouse gases, moving what do you call them? Enriched earth or what do they call them? The underground materials from Russia, selling of uranium and things like that, or any of the other things that Russia has in abundance that we may not have. And he was talking about it. But now there's still Americans who fought or aided Russia have found themselves unwelcome upon their return. They have passport revocations, loss of citizenship, or the threat of existing criminal charges which could strand them abroad. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. There's two more parts to this that I wanted to get to, but obviously I'm not going to get there tonight. The next part is administrative passport revocations of U.S. born citizens on national security grounds that are not connected to war. Okay, this could be worldwide and global. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on the legality of that process and where the how these passport revocations occur and what actions you can take after that, if any, or if you're just flat out screwed because the State Department decides to revoke your passport. That is uh, actually one of the things they can do. And so, therefore, you need to be careful when you go abroad and agree to fight for a foreign military. that is a tough gig, and you probably shouldn't do it. I hope you enjoyed that segment of where we are. Let's see if I can cover just a couple of things. I also am working on another satirical. I told you about my theorem that Trump 2.0 equals Biden 1.0 that we went through in the first 10 minutes of this program. I have another one with a great a great video of it, and I think I'm going to hold it. Well, I am going to hold it until Sunday, first 10 minutes of Sunday. Sunday, we're supposed to talk with Ike Skelton. We have a show that I would like you all to be a part of and would like you all to listen to. Ike is a personal hero of mine because of his stance on this. And Ike has been charged with a crime for doing his job, depending on how you look at it. And so, if he thought he was doing his job, perhaps he should be allowed to walk, and there should be a motion to dismiss. Pending on that matter. And so, we are going to talk about that, hopefully with Ike in the studio or on the phone or something with me when he is around this Sunday night. I think it would be nice to join that program. A lot of people to come and discuss it and chat about it. It is an event that I have shared on my Facebook page, and you can go out and find it as an event in my page and sign up to show up. But it will be on Sunday night, and we are very much looking forward to it. And it will be on Ike and his troubles and dilemma. We're going to go through some of the law. I have a pretty in-depth look at that and where we go from there. This is Damn Radio. I am Samuel Trapp, and we are coming up on the end of the program. Please feel free and join me every night, Sunday through Thursday at 9 p.m., going till 10:30 in Chicago time, Central Standard Time. If you wish to go out to our Damn Radio page, please do. You will find our Listen Live button. You can download an app. You can so that you're alerted every time a new show comes up. You can listen to all of our podcasts or listen live through there. And you can also, should you feel the urge, go to internationalflavor.com. If I can encourage you to go there, I kind of want to brag about my, I suppose a better word for them would be an album cover. Because every show I put a new album cover out there for the show, somewhat based upon the topics that we're discussing. It'll have a Damn Radio logo, an International Flavor logo, and things like that for the most part. And then there's some pretty good logos that I've come up with. So I'm going to put the theorem out there, I think, for tonight's show. My theorem of Trump 2.0 equals Biden 1.0, so that you can read it. At any rate, I appreciate you being here tonight. Join me tomorrow night and every night at 9 p.m. Have a good evening.